Welcome back to Criminally Human, where behind every headline is a person, a story, and a tragedy that didn't have to happen. Before we get into it, let me make something clear. It's obvious that some people don't bother to read my disclaimer or even watch the entire video before they rush to comment. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here to point out what others don't want us to see, and to show the lengths some will go to justify the survivor's actions. If that makes you uncomfortable, that says more about you than it does about me. My job is to question the inconsistencies, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Now that the body cam footage of the Idaho4 has been released, let's first talk about trauma, what it really looks like, what it doesn't, and where the inconsistencies begin. And yes, I'm qualified to know. I've studied trauma, I've worked with trauma, and I know how it should seep through people when they've lived in horror. The release of the Moscow police body cam footage was supposed to bring clarity. It was supposed to show the raw aftermath. Two traumatized young women, frozen by shock, trying to process the massacre inside their home. But what it actually showed was something far more chilling, the beginning of a narrative being shaped. Dylan Mortensen, wrapped in a blanket, is calm enough to recount what she says happened. She claims she heard noises. Kaylee with the dog, Xana crying, and a male voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She says she cracked her door and saw a masked man in black with bushy eyebrows. She says she froze, shut her door, and thought he left through the sliding glass door. But on camera, it doesn't sound like trauma vomiting out fragments of memory. Trauma is messy, incoherent, frantic. Dylan's words are measured, selective, almost rehearsed. She doesn't sound like a victim. She sounds like someone telling a story she already knows the ending to. Bethany Funk, meanwhile, is nearly invisible in the footage. She doesn't look like a survivor of a massacre. She looks quiet, composed, present but detached. And later in her courtroom statement, she admitted something that still rattles anyone who hears it. She woke up with a toothache, called her father, took Advil and went back to sleep. That's not trauma. That's routine. And then there's the friends. Before the police even cleared the house, friends had been called to the scene. One of them, Hunter Johnson, went inside and discovered the horror, telling Dylan and Bethany not to look. Think about that. Instead of calling 911, they called friends. Those friends contaminated the scene before law enforcement ever secured it. The body cam doesn't show two girls paralyzed by fear. It shows two young women capable of speaking, recounting, choosing words, and summoning peers before summoning help. The actions on that tape aren't trauma. It's calculation. The murders are believed to have occurred between 4 o'clock and 4:25 a.m. But the survivors weren't asleep through it. Phone records show that Dylan and Bethany were awake, texting and calling between 4:22 and 4:32. Dylan texted Kaylee, "Please answer." Bethany placed multiple calls to Madison and Kaylee around 4:29 to 4:31. They weren't unconscious. They weren't clueless. They were aware enough to send messages, to dial their friends, but not the police. And then there's Bethany's own admission she woke with a toothache, phoned her father, took Advil and went back to sleep. Her roommates' bodies were still bleeding out in the same house, but she chose routine, pills and more rest. If trauma froze her, how did she manage to inquire about her poor little hurt tooth? How did she manage to take medicine and fall asleep again? Trauma didn't stop her from living her life that morning. It stopped her from calling for help. The final 911 call wasn't placed until 11:58 a.m. But even then, it wasn't Dylan or Bethany who made it. It came after friends arrived and discovered what they wouldn't admit for hours. That's nearly 8 hours of silence. 8 hours where texts flew, Advil was swallowed, friends were summoned, and time kept ticking. And then there's the body cam. While Dylan and Bethany stood outside being questioned, someone else went inside the house. A male, barefoot of all things, in the cold of a November morning in Idaho, entered the blood-soaked scene. Why was he there? Why wasn't he stopped? And why was he shoeless? Nothing about that moment makes sense. Not for police procedure, not for human behavior. It's another piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit the official frame. The timeline prosecutors fed the public is duct-taped together with trauma. But trauma doesn't explain 4:32 a.m. texts. Trauma doesn't explain an Advil. Trauma doesn't explain calling friends instead of 911. And trauma doesn't explain a barefoot man walking into a house full of bodies. 8 hours of silence is not trauma. It's complicity. The contradictions run deeper than just the clock. They live in every statement Dylan and Bethany have ever made. Dylan's story begins on Bodycam. Vague, halting, careful. But on the affidavit, it transforms into something crisp, cinematic. Suddenly, her memory is razor sharp. Suddenly, the bushy eyebrows are etched into history like a positive ID, even though filings later revealed she never actually identified Kohberger. Even when shown his photo, she couldn't confirm it was him. But the media ran with it. The prosecution leaned on it. And the public believed it. That's not testimony. That's narrative building. Bethany's role, too, has shifted. At first, she was practically invisible, treated as a non-factor. But later, her phone records were pulled into the spotlight to prop up the prosecution's timeline. And then her own words, her Advil confession, destroyed the illusion of shock. She wasn't asleep through the morning. She was awake. She was in pain. She made calls. She took medicine. She went back to bed. And then there's Hunter Johnson. The body cam captures him entering the house while Dylan and Bethany stood outside. Think about that contradiction. The affidavit portrays them as terrified, frozen in fear, paralyzed by trauma. Yet there they are on camera, composed enough to stand with officers while their friend walks into the very house they supposedly couldn't bring themselves to enter or report. If they were too afraid to dial 911, how did they have the composure to call friends, answer questions, and watch as someone else went inside? Everywhere you look, the cracks widen. Dylan's words on camera don't match her words on paper. Bethany's silence doesn't match her Advil admission. Their fear doesn't match the body cam footage of them standing calmly in blankets while others entered the scene. These aren't small inconsistencies. These are gaping contradictions that call into question whether these women were victims frozen by trauma or unreliable narrators shaping their own stories. The truth is simple. Trauma may blur details, but it doesn't invent them. Trauma may delay action, but it doesn't explain Advil and sleep. Trauma doesn't create 8 hours of silence while texts and calls pile up unanswered. What Dylan and Bethany have given us isn't trauma. It's testimony that shifts with the wind. It's lies that calcified into a narrative. And the body cam proves it. Because once you see the footage, once you trace the timeline, once you hear the contradictions in their own voices, one thing becomes clear. These women aren't as clean as we've been told. From the very beginning, defenders of Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk have leaned on one word to excuse everything: trauma. Trauma is the blanket explanation. Trauma froze them. Trauma confused them. Trauma explains the 8-hour silence, the contradictory statements, the calm composure on body cam. It's all trauma, we're told. But here's the problem. When you hold up their actions against what trauma experts know, and against what the footage shows, the explanation collapses. Yes, trauma can paralyze. Yes, trauma can fracture memory. Yes, trauma can make people act irrationally in moments of danger. Trauma doesn't stop you from dialing 911 while still allowing you to text your friends, call your dad about a toothache, swallow Advil, and go back to sleep. Trauma doesn't selectively silence some actions while allowing others. Take Dylan's case. She claims she opened her door multiple times, heard voices, and even saw a masked man in black with bushy eyebrows. She says she froze, that she was paralyzed with fear, and that's why she didn't act. But paralysis doesn't explain how she was coherent enough hours later to tell officers a clean story. Paralysis doesn't explain the selective detail, that she noticed eyebrows but not a face, that she remembered words but not a timeline. Paralysis is messy. Dylan's story is neat. It's way too neat, actually. And Bethany. Trauma doesn't explain her either. She admits she woke up with a toothache, phoned her father, took Advil and went back to sleep. That's not paralysis. That's not dissociation. That's mundane. It's routine. Trauma doesn't send you into autopilot for dental advice while bodies are cooling in the next room. Trauma doesn't explain why, after more sleep, she still didn't think to call 911 until friends arrived nearly 5 hours later. And then there's the body cam. The footage shows them outside, wrapped in blankets, standing calmly with officers. They're coherent. They're speaking. They're aware enough to answer questions while Hunter Johnson goes inside the house. That isn't trauma-induced collapse. That's composure. And that composure undermines every attempt to excuse their inaction with psychology. The truth is this. Trauma can account for hesitation in the moment, but it cannot account for 8 hours of silence. Trauma can explain confusion in a statement, but it cannot explain contradictory narratives that grow sharper over time. Trauma can excuse a frozen body, but it cannot excuse the choice to summon friends instead of police, or to take Advil and go back to bed. So why lean so heavily on trauma? Because it's convenient. Because it makes Dylan and Bethany untouchable in the eyes of the public. Because if they're victims of trauma, then their contradictions don't matter, their silence doesn't matter, their suspicious behavior doesn't matter. Trauma has become their shield. But when you strip it away, what's left isn't innocent. It's inconsistent. It's damning. The question isn't whether Dylan and Bethany experienced trauma. Of course they did. The question is whether trauma is enough to explain their actions. And when you stack the evidence, the texts, the Advil, the body cam footage, the barefoot mail, the 8-hour delay, the answer is no. Trauma isn't enough. Not even close. If you think that's trauma, then slap my ass and call me Susie. Trauma doesn't explain why two grown adults, aware enough to text each other, aware enough to make phone calls, aware enough to take medicine, did not make the one call that mattered. What it does explain is this. The official story is broken. And every time we hold the footage up to the survivor's words, the cracks spread wider. The King Road house has been torn down. The walls are gone. The evidence is gone. But the questions remain. And those questions scream louder than the silence ever did. This isn't about trauma. This isn't about innocence. This is about two survivors whose words and actions don't align. Two survivors whose stories collapse under scrutiny. Two survivors who aren't as clean as the public has been led to believe. Because when the body cam doesn't match the accounts, when the timeline doesn't match the choices, when the explanations don't match reality, there's only one conclusion left. It's not adding up. Defenders will keep saying it was trauma. That's the word they cling to. But here's the truth. Most people who experience real trauma in moments of horror don't react the way Dylan and Bethany did. Real trauma looks frantic. It looks like panic calls to 911 that don't even make sense because the victim can't find the words. It looks like screaming for neighbors. It looks like pounding on doors, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for someone to come help. It looks like incoherent statements in the first moments, not polished affidavits written weeks later. Real trauma doesn't text, "Please answer," instead of "Help me." Real trauma doesn't wait until nearly noon while bodies lie rotting just a few feet away. And yet that's exactly what happened here. These weren't the actions of people frozen by fear. These were the choices of people who either didn't want to act, or who had reasons for staying silent that were not being told. So don't let anyone gaslight you into believing this was just trauma. Trauma can explain a moment. Cannot explain 8 hours of silence. It cannot explain contradictions that grow sharper with time. And it cannot explain why, when the house itself has been bulldozed and the physical truth erased, all we're left with are words that don't match reality. That's not trauma. That's a cover story. And no matter how hard they push it, it's still not adding up. The truth is simple. Real trauma is chaotic, loud, and undeniable. But what we see here isn't trauma. It's silence, it's contradictions. It's a carefully shaped story that doesn't match reality. The body cam footage doesn't lie. The timeline doesn't lie. The contradictions don't lie. And together they paint a picture that is impossible to ignore. Because 4 students are gone, a house has been torn down, and 2 survivors remain. And yet, the more we learn, the less it adds up. So ask yourself this. If the footage doesn't match the testimony, if the timeline doesn't match the choices, and if the words don't match reality, what are we really being told? This isn't trauma. This isn't innocence. This is a cover story. And no matter how much they push it, it still doesn't add up. Now that I've explained this, don't come in my comments screaming, "He's guilty." The truth is, these so-called survivors are guilty too. Guilty of not calling for help, guilty of not being honest, and guilty of thinking the rest of us don't have a brain. Newsflash. Not everybody is gonna swallow whatever story the media spoon-feeds. Some of us actually question things. If you've got time to text, post on social media, ask for dental advice, hear a dog barking, hear what you say are fireworks and see a bushy eyebrow man telling you you'll be fine. Then my golly, you've got time to call 911, but instead they called friends and went back to bed first. If I'm being honest, I don't for 1 second believe any of this. I believe they were in there cleaning up and coming up with their story, and I said what I said. So to all the people saying their actions were just trauma, spare me. If you're ever in a situation like this, I hope your loved ones aren't blind to the same inconsistencies that thousands of us can see. And if I'm ever in that position, God help me if I'm surrounded by people who suddenly decide trauma is optional, kicking in when it excuses lies, and vanishing when accountability is needed. You keep saying they were afraid. But don't you think the real victims were too? Don't you think they were hoping that the very people in the same home would have sent help? So miss me with the trauma excuse. Fear doesn't erase responsibility. Maybe all you trauma experts should grab a piece of that GoFundMe money they collected, because you're working overtime excusing their reckless behavior and lies. If these so-called survivors were smart enough to attend college, party, drink, use drugs, and handle the police when noise complaints came in, then they were smart enough to know they should have called 911. No excuses. So for all of you yelling defamation and insensitive, it's called public record and my opinion. Don't like it. Take it up with the body cam, not me. This has been another episode of Criminally Human, where the more people defend this foolery, the deeper I'll dig and the more I'll expose.